Okay, we're going to start chapter 3 of Frindle. It's called The Question. The first day of school was always a get acquainted day. Books were passed out and there was a lot of chatter. Everyone asked, what did you do over the summer? Period 1 through 6 went by very quickly for Nick. But then came period 7. Mrs. Granger's class was all business. The first thing they did was take a vocabulary pre-test to see how many of the 35 words for the week the kids already knew. Tremble, circular, orchestra, the list went on and on. Nick knew most of them. Then there was a handout about class procedures. After that, there was a review paper about cursive writing, and then there was a sample sheet showing how the heading should look on every assignment. No let up for 35 minutes straight. Nick was an expert at asking the delaying question, also known as the teacher stopper or the guaranteed time waster. I know a few of you do that. At 3 minutes before the bell, in the split second between the end of today's work and the announcement of tomorrow's work, Nick could launch a question guaranteed to sidetrack the teacher long enough to delay or even wipe out the homework assignment. Timing was important, but asking the right question, that was the hard part. Questions about stuff in the news, questions about the college the teacher went to, questions about the teacher's favorite book or sport or hobby. Nick knew all the tricks, and he had been very successful in the past. Here he was in 5th grade, near the end of his very first language arts class with Mrs. Granger, and Nick could feel a homework assignment coming the way a farmer can feel a rainstorm. Mrs. Granger paused to catch her breath, and Nick's hand shot up. She glanced down at her seating chart and then up at him. Her sharp grey eyes were not even turned up to half power. Yes, Nicholas? Mrs. Granger, you have so many dictionaries in the room, and that huge one especially. Where did all those words come from? Did they just get copied from other dictionaries? It sure is a big book. It was a perfect thought grenade. Kapow! 7 kids smiled, and a few peeked at the clock. Nick was famous for this, and the whole class knew what he was doing. Unfortunately, so did Mrs. Granger. She hesitated a moment and gave Nick a smile that was just a little too sweet to be real. Her eyes were the color of a thundercloud. Why, what an interesting question, Nicholas. I could talk about that for hours, I bet. She glanced around the classroom. Do the rest of you want to know too? Everyone nodded. Very well then, Nicholas. Will you do some research on that subject and give a little oral report for the class? If you find out the answer yourself, it will mean so much more than if I just told you. Please have your report ready by our next class. Mrs. Granger smiled at him again, very sweetly. Then it was back to business. Now, the homework for tomorrow can be found on page 12 of your Words Alive books. ... Nick barely heard the assignment. His heart was pounding. He felt very small, very, very small. He could feel the tops of his ears glowing red, a complete shutdown, an extra assignment, and probably a little black mark next to his name on the seating chart. Everything he had heard about this teacher was true. Don't mess around with the lone Granger. Chapter 4, Word Detective. It was a beautiful September afternoon, bright sun, cool breeze, blue sky, but not for Nick. Nick had to do a little report for the next day, plus copy all of the definitions for 35 words. For Mrs. Granger, this was not the way school was supposed to work, not for Nick. There was a rule at Nick's house. Homework first, and that meant right after school. Nick had heard his older brother James groan and grumble about the rules for years, right up until he graduated from high school 2 years ago. And then James wrote home from college after his first semester and said, "My grades are looking great, because when I came here, I already knew how to put first things first." That letter was proof Nick's mum and dad had been looking for. Homework first was the law, September to June. There's a picture of Nick. Homework first. This had never bothered Nick before because he hardly ever had homework. Oh, sure, he looked over the spelling words on Thursday nights, and there have been a few short book reports in 4th grade, but other than that, nothing. Up to now, schoolwork was never spilled over to his free time, thanks to Mrs. Granger. Those days were gone. Just turn off my phone, sorry. First, he looked up the definitions in the brand new red dictionary that his mum had brought because Mrs. Granger had told her to. It took almost an hour. He could hear a baseball game in John's yard down the street, yelling and shouting, and every few minutes the sharp crack of a bat connecting with a pitch. But he had a report to do for Mrs. Granger. Nick looked at the very front of the dictionary. There was an introduction to the book called Words and Their Origins. Perfect, Nick thought. It was just what he needed to do his report. It'd be all over in a few minutes. Nick could already feel the sun and the breeze on his face as he ran outside to play. Homework all done. Then he read the first sentence from the introduction. Without question, this modern American dictionary is one of the most surprisingly complex and profound documents ever to be created, for it embodies unparalleled etymological detail, reflecting not only superb lexicographic scholarship, but also the dreams and speech and imaginative talents of millions of people from thousands of years. For every person who has ever spoken or written in English has had its hand in its making. What? Nick scratched his head and read it again, and then again. Not much better. It was sort of like trying to read the ingredients on a shampoo bottle. He slammed the dictionary shut and walked downstairs. Nick's family did a lot of reading. So bookshelves covered 3 or 4 walls of the family room. There were 2 sets of encyclopedias. The black set was for grown-ups and the red set was for kids. Nick pulled out the D volume from the red set and looked up a dictionary. There were 3 full pages with headings like Early Dictionaries, Word Detectives, and Dictionaries Today. Not very exciting. But he had to do it, so Nick just plopped down on the couch and read all of it. And when he was finished with the kid's book, he opened up the black encyclopedia and read most of what it said about dictionaries too. He understood only about half of what he read. He leaned back on the couch and covered his eyes with his arm, trying to imagine himself giving a report on all this boring stuff. He'd be lucky to have 3 minutes worth. But because Nick was Nick, he suddenly had an idea, and it brought a grin to his face. Nick decided that giving his report could actually be fun. He could make it into something special. After all, Mrs. Granger had asked for it. Chapter 5, The Report. By lunchtime the next day, Nick had a bad feeling in the pit of his stomach. 7th period was coming. He was going to have to stand up in front of Mrs. Granger's class. The eyes of everyone in the class would be glued to his face, and Mrs. Granger's eyes would be cranked up to maximum punch power. He looked over his notes again and again. The first English dictionary, The Growth of the English Language, William Shakespeare, words from French and German, new words, old words, new inventions, Anglo-Saxon words, Latin and Greek roots, American English. It all became a big jumble in his mind. And his grand plan from the night before, in the harsh fluorescent lights of the school day, it seemed impossible. What is it with clocks in school? When you're planning to go to the carnival after school, the clocks in every class practically run backwards. The school day lasts for about 3 weeks. But if you have to go to the barber or go shopping for clothes after school, zip, the whole day is over before you can blink. And today, after lunch, period 5, 6 went by in 2 ticks. As the 7th period bell rang, Mrs. Granger walked into the classroom, took 4 steps to her desk at the side of the room, flipped open her attendance book, glanced out at the class, and made 2 little check marks. Then, looking up at Nick, she said, "I think we have a little report to begin our class today. Nicholas?" 15 seconds into 7th period, and Nick was on stage. This lady plays for keeps, Nick thought. He gulped, grabbed his crumbled note cards and his book bag, and walked to the front of the room. He stood next to the giant dictionary on its little table. And Mrs. Granger walked to the back of the classroom and sat primarily on a stool next to the bookcases. She was wearing her blue uniform. Taking a deep breath, Nick began. "Well, the first thing I learned is that the first English dictionary." Mrs. Granger interrupted. "Excuse me, Nicholas, but does your book report have a title?" Nick looked blankly at her. "A title? No, I didn't make a title." "Class, please, remember to include a title whenever you prepare an oral or written report. Now, please go on, Nicholas." And she smiled and nodded at him. Nicholas began again. Looking right at Mrs. Granger, he said, "The dictionary." A couple of kids thought it was funny, but Nick played it straight and just kept talking. "A lot of people think that the first English dictionary was put together in the 1700s by a man named Samuel Johnson. He lived in London, England. He was real smart, and he wrote a lot of books. And he wanted all the other smart people to have a good dictionary to use, so he made one. But there were other dictionaries before his. The thing that was different about Johnson's dictionary was the size, first of all. It had over 43,000 words in it. The class made a whole bunch of noises at this number, ooh and wow, and stuff like that. And Nick lost his concentration. He glanced up at Mrs. Granger, expecting to see those eyes drilling a hole in him. But they weren't. They were almost friendly in a teachery kind of way. See, she shushed the class and said, "Go on, Nicholas, that's a fine beginning." Nick almost smiled. But he saw all the kids staring at him, so he gripped his note cards even tighter and jumped back in. The other thing that Samuel Johnson did that was so special was to choose the words he thought were most important, and then give lots of examples showing how the words got used by people. For example, he showed how the word take could be used in 113 different ways. Nick's report went smoothly for 12 minutes. Nick was surprised at how easy it was to stand there and talk about this stuff. At the end of his first 5 minutes, Mrs. Granger had to stop Nick again to say, "Class, it is not good manners to yawn out loud or to put your head down on your desk when someone is giving an oral report." No one in the class cared one little bit about the report, except Mrs. Granger. Every time Nick glanced up, she was smiling, and her eyes were not the least bit icy or sharp. She was eating this stuff up, listening and nodding, and every once in a while she would say, "Very good point," or "Yes, that's exactly right." But the next time Nick looked up, he saw Mrs. Granger sneaking a look at her watch. 18 minutes gone. Maybe his idea was going to work after all. Time for facts, too. Reaching into his book bag, Nick pulled out the red dictionary he had brought from home, the one that most of the kids had, and the one that Mrs. Granger said they should choose. Nick said, "This is the dictionary that I use at home for my vocabulary work, and I opened it up last night to the very front, and right there I found a lot about how the dictionary is made, right in this book. So I thought some of the ideas would be good as part of my report. It says here, Nicholas," Nick looked up. Mrs. Granger got off her tall stool and its wooden legs made a screech on the linoleum. Head snapped to attention and the class was alert again. Mrs. Granger smiled, raised her eyebrows, and pointed at her watch. Nicholas, I think class should read this at home themselves. Now. John's hand went up in the air and Mrs. Granger's nod, he said, but I don't have that dictionary at home, Mrs. Granger. I have the blue one. And several other kids immediately said, me too. Mrs. Granger tried not to show that she was annoyed. Very well, Nick, but it shouldn't take too long. We have other things to do today. Nick kept his eyes open and wide and nodded, adjusted his glasses on his nose and began to read. Without question, this modern American dictionary is one of the most surprisingly complex and profound documents ever to be created, for it embodies unparalleled etymological detail, reflecting not only superb lexicographical scholarship, but also the dreams and speech and imaginative talents of millions of people over thousands of years. For every person who's ever spoken or written in English has had to make a hand in its making. It was a long article, and the kids were bored to death, but no one looked bored at all. Every kid in the room knew now that the period was more than half over, and Nick's report wasn't just a report. It was one of the greatest time wasters he had ever invented. Mrs. Granger knew it too. She had edged around the back of the room to the side near the windows. Nick glanced at her now and then as he read, and each time Mrs. Granger's eyes clicked up to a new power level. After 8 minutes of Nick's best non-stop reading, her eyes were practically burning holes in the chalkboard behind him. There were only 10 minutes left in the 7th period. When he took a breath to start a new paragraph, Mrs. Granger cut him off. That's a fine place to stop, Nicholas. Class, let's all give him a round of applause for this report. The applause didn't last that long. As Nick took his book bag and notes and sat down, Mrs. Granger's eyes went back to almost normal, and she actually smiled at him. Although your report was a little long, she paused and let that sink in, it was quite a good one. And isn't it fascinating that English has had more different words than any other language there used to be anywhere in the world? She pointed at her large dictionary. That one book contains definitions of more than 450,000 words. Now, wasn't I right, Nicholas? All this will mean so much more since you learned about it on your own. Mrs. Granger was beaming at him. Nick sank lower in his chair. This was worse than writing the report, worse than standing up to give it. He was being treated like the teacher's pet, and he had this feeling she was doing it on purpose. His reputation was in great danger. She launched another question. He raised his hand, and he didn't even wait for Mrs. Granger to call on him. Yeah, but I still really don't get the idea of why all words mean different things. Like, who says D-O-G means the stuff that goes woof and wags its tail? Who says so? And Mrs. Granger took the bait. Who says dog means dog? You do, Nicholas. You and I and everyone in this class and in this school and this town and this state and this country, we all agree. If I lived in France, we would all agree that the right word for that hairy, four-legged creature would be a different word. Chien. It sounds like chien, but it means what? D-O-G means to you and me. And in Germany, they say Hund, and so on, all around the globe. But if all of us in this room decided to call the creature something else, and everyone else did too, then that's what it would be called. And one day it would be written in the dictionary that way. We decide what goes in that book. And she pointed at the giant dictionary, and she looked right at Nick and smiled again. This picture, who's to say dog means dog? Then Mrs. Granger went on. But of course, that dictionary was worked on by hundreds of very smart people for many years. So as far as we are concerned, that dictionary is the law. Laws can change, of course, but only if they need to. There must be new words that need to be made, but the ones in that book have been put there for a good reason. Mrs. Granger took a look at the clock. 8 minutes left. Now then, for today you were to have done the exercises beginning on page 12 in your Words Alive book. Please get out your papers. Sarah, will you read the first sentence, identify the mistake, and then tell us how you corrected it? Mrs. Granger jammed the whole day's work into the last 8 minutes. A blur of verbs and nouns and prepositions, and yes, there was another homework assignment. And Nick didn't try to sidetrack Mrs. G again. He had slowed her down a little bit, but had he stopped her? No way. She was unstoppable, at least for today. All right, so chapter 6 is called The Big Idea, and we will read that tomorrow.